Section 1. Arrival. The road towards a Victorian workhouse often ended beside a plain boundary wall. Beyond it stood an institution serving several neighbouring parishes together. The building represented indoor relief, meaning help given within an institution. Its rooms offered shelter, food, clothing, care, and ordered daily activity. These provisions came with separation, supervision, and many written procedures. Comfort was deliberately limited within the system designed after the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. Buildings differed, local offices differed, and conditions altered during the century. The new law placed neighbouring parishes into administrative groups called unions. Each union had a board of guardians responsible for local poor relief. The guardians arranged a workhouse and appointed officers to manage its routine. This system made a public building central to many relief decisions. A person seeking indoor support therefore entered an organized local structure. The journey might begin in any parish belonging to that union. Surviving records reveal administration more clearly than private thoughts or feelings. They show names crossing official pages, but never preserve every arrival. Large workhouses built after reform often expressed separation through their physical planning. Historic England notes the influence of model plans during the 1840s. Separate ranges, yards, routes, and rooms helped officers maintain different resident classes. Such design principles were influential, though local buildings never formed one identical pattern. Some unions adapted older premises instead of constructing complete new institutions. Others added ranges as needs and expectations changed. A wall, corridor, or locked doorway could therefore have an administrative purpose. Architecture turned written classification into movement through particular spaces. Approaching the entrance meant moving from an ordinary road into managed premises. The rules begin with officers and procedures, not with a universal emotional scene. No surviving order can tell us what every newcomer noticed first. Brick, stone, gates, windows, and enclosed ground varied from place to place. The entrance led towards admission rather than directly into an ordinary ward. This distinction mattered because officers first recorded, examined, washed, and classified newcomers. Arrival was the beginning of several linked duties. The evidence here supports only the common administrative setting of indoor relief. Archival voices sometimes describe genuine experiences through letters and complaints. Their survival reminds us that residents could respond to administration in writing. Their limits also encourage careful language about what usually happened. The official vocabulary could make human circumstances appear remarkably compact. A person receiving relief might be called a pauper in administrative records. That was a formal category used by the system, not a complete identity. Registers arranged people by name, status, age, movement, and institutional class. Such entries helped officers manage rooms, food, clothing, labor, and discharge. They also reduced varied lives to columns prepared for official purposes. Reading these documents quietly requires attention to both their value and narrowness. A line in a book records presence, while leaving much unspoken. Workhouse comfort was deliberately limited within post-reform policy. Historic England describes this restriction as a defining feature of the system. Formal provision existed beside discipline and separation. Shelter was real, and so were rules governing the shelter. Food was supplied, yet menus followed approved institutional schedules. Clothing was issued, while personal garments could be stored away. Education and medical attendance existed within similarly managed frameworks. For a newcomer, the outer building was only the broadest visible layer. Inside stood receiving areas, ordinary wards, dormitories, workspaces, dining places, and offices. Infirmary accommodation might occupy another portion of the site. Schoolrooms were common, especially where children lived within the institution. The exact arrangement depended upon local construction and later alteration. Model planning influenced workhouses without erasing regional materials, older structures, or changing demands. Men and women generally followed separate institutional paths after admission. Husbands and wives lived apart under the classification system. Parents and children could also be placed in different parts. These divisions are supported as broad features of post-reform workhouses. Rules could prescribe order, while buildings and offices shaped actual implementation. Written systems describe intention more securely than universal daily compliance. A calm view of arrival therefore begins with administrative scale. One parish no longer acted entirely alone within the reformed arrangement. A union connected several communities to one board and its officers. The workhouse gathered many relief functions behind a managed entrance. Its internal divisions reflected categories established by central rules. Local guardians then applied those rules through staff, rooms, books, and supplies. This mixture of national prescription and local operation explains many variations. It also prevents one surviving example from standing for every English workhouse. The National Archives preserves both official guidance and residents' correspondence. Together, these sources show different levels of the historical record. Rules explain what officers were directed to do. Registers demonstrate the kinds of facts institutions tried to retain. Letters sometimes reveal dissatisfaction, requests, or particular conditions. None of these sources alone gives a complete ordinary day. The quiet building imagined here remains general, while claims stay attached to records. At the entrance, institutional time replaced the looser pace of the road. Admission involved waiting, recording, examination, and movement into assigned accommodation. The order of these stages was prescribed in detailed administrative instructions. Nor can one assume that every officer completed each duty perfectly. From the gate, the next space was the receiving department. The union system changed the scale at which relief was discussed. Decisions connected several parishes through common offices and shared premises. A resident from one locality entered a building serving many others. This enlarged field affected records, costs, and available accommodation. It could also place the workhouse beyond a familiar neighborhood. The sources establish this structure without tracing one person's route. Distance and transport remain local questions beyond this general account. Outside and inside were separated by more than a boundary wall. The entrance concentrated authority in a porter, registers, and admission rules. Beyond that point, ordinary access yielded to permission and classification. Visitors, officers, supplies, and residents used space for different purposes. Controlled circulation nevertheless follows from separated departments and supervised admission. Institutional planning made movement a managed resource alongside food, clothing, and beds. The workhouse's public purpose appeared through its administrative identity. It belonged to a union rather than a private household. Guardians answered for its operation within the relief system. Appointed officers carried daily responsibilities inside its walls. Central authorities issued orders intended to standardize major procedures. Local circumstances still shaped what residents encountered. This layered authority explains nationally clear rules beside geographically uneven practice. Weather, season, and time surely affected individual arrivals. Calm history needs no invented rain upon every institutional gate. The durable setting is administrative rather than theatrical. A person came from a parish into union provision. The entrance opened towards examination and classification. Those supported transitions carry more meaning than decorative atmosphere. Section 2. Admission. The receiving ward stood between arrival and ordinary workhouse life. It allowed newcomers to remain apart while officers completed preliminary duties. Separation at this point had practical and medical purposes within the rules. A porter dealt with entrance information and access to the premises. The master and matron held broader responsibility for their respective departments. Medical examination also belonged to the prescribed admission process. These duties formed an administrative chain, although local performance could vary. The Consolidated General Order of 1847 describes admission in connected articles. It is a rule book rather than a diary of ordinary experience. Its wording tells us what officials expected from compliant institutions. Still, the order provides the clearest framework for a responsible reconstruction. It links examination, cleansing, clothing, searching, storage, and classification. Each stage affected where a resident went and what happened to possessions. The porter's position joined the outside entrance to internal administration. Admission details entered institutional records as part of that responsibility. Names and circumstances became information for later decisions by other officers. A person did not simply choose an empty bed and settle there. Movement depended upon health, sex, age, and official classification. The receiving area therefore operated as a place of sorting and transition. Its doorways connected record-keeping with the physical plan of the building. Medical examination was prescribed before ordinary placement within the house. The medical officer looked for illness and considered suitable accommodation. Anyone needing separation could be directed away from healthy residents. This requirement shows why receiving wards mattered beyond mere paperwork. It also reveals an institutional concern with managing sickness among grouped populations. The rule establishes an intended safeguard, not the quality of each examination. Surviving evidence does not justify imagining instruments, spoken exchanges, or precise routines everywhere. Officers classified residents into divisions recognized by the order. Sex, age, health, and ability to work shaped those divisions. Classification determined wards, yards, labor, supervision, and much daily company. In architecture, a central passage might divide access towards separate ranges. In administration, a register or order made the same division visible on paper. The system thus joined labels, rooms, and routes. A newcomer's place within the institution followed these managed categories. Family separation was among the most consequential results of classification. Men and women occupied different parts of the workhouse. Married couples therefore lived separately within ordinary arrangements. Children could be housed away from their parents and taught elsewhere. Historic England confirms these broad post-reform patterns. Admission also established responsibility for personal property. The order directed officers to search newcomers under specified procedures. Clothes and permitted possessions were to be listed, cleaned when needed, and stored. This process protected institutional control and prepared items for possible return. Searching rules were prescribed, so uniform observance should not be assumed. Storage required labels, space, and accurate association with each owner. An error in any step could matter later, though no error is invented here. The receiving ward belonged to neither street life nor settled ward routine. Its temporary character distinguished it from sleeping and working departments. New residents waited while their institutional position became formally clear. Its documented function was examination, cleansing, and classification before ordinary placement. Institutional layouts changed, even where the same central order applied. The master supervised the general establishment and many mail arrangements. The matron carried corresponding duties within the women's side. Other officers included the medical officer, school staff, and porter. Their responsibilities met during admission because one person crossed several departments. A record begun near the entrance could affect clothing, ward assignment, meals, and work. This was administration expressed through a sequence of ordinary actions. It depended upon cooperation among staff whose competence naturally varied. Not every newcomer belonged in the same kind of accommodation. Illness could require infirmary care rather than an ordinary receiving space. Children needed classification connected with schooling and age. Adults judged capable of labor entered work arrangements suited to their class. Older or infirm residents required other placement. The order's categories aimed to make these differences manageable. They could also separate people whose relationships continued beyond administrative labels. Admission records are valuable because they can mark the beginning of residence. Local archives may preserve admission and discharge books for particular unions. Survival differs greatly, and many sequences contain gaps. Where books remain, researchers can sometimes follow repeated entries or family connections. Those possibilities do not make the record complete. A missing name may reflect loss, arrangement, spelling, or another administrative route. Archival silence should never become a confident claim about absence. The receiving process also demonstrates how rules should be read historically. A command to clean, examine, or record proves a required action. Complaints may show failures, but they form an uneven surviving sample. Official reports may emphasize procedure and institutional order. The most reliable account keeps requirement and observed experience separate. Here, the sequence remains prescribed unless a source directly documents local practice. Once examination and classification were complete, the resident moved further inside. Personal clothes no longer served as ordinary workhouse dress. The next prescribed stage involved cleansing and an institutional clothing issue. Possessions remained associated with the stored bundle for later discharge. Doors now led from temporary reception towards the divided house. The building's plan guided each class along its own route. Admission turned broad relief policy into several small acts. A name was taken, health considered, property handled, and placement chosen. Each action belonged to an officer's stated responsibility. Together, they made an individual legible to the institution. The sequence also created opportunities for delay or imperfect execution. They remain standards against which other records may be compared. The receiving department protected classification before settled routine began. Newcomers had not yet joined the established population of a ward. Temporary separation allowed decisions without disrupting ordinary accommodation. It also reduced immediate mixing when illness was suspected. These purposes follow the order's linked requirements. Material conditions need inspection reports or testimony from a named union. Official examination could involve facts already supplied elsewhere. Workhouse books nevertheless required information in institutional form. Standard entries connected admission with later discharge. They also enabled guardians and inspectors to review administration. The individual became part of a sequence that could be traced. This documentary logic explains why records survive more often than conversation. Institutions preserved what their procedures required them to know. Classification simplified management, but people did not fit simple labels perfectly. Age, health, family position, and ability could overlap. Officers still chose accommodation within available local space. The order supplied categories and responsibilities, not effortless decisions. This difference matters when reading tidy official columns. A completed entry may conceal uncertainty at the moment of writing. The archive often preserves the result without the discussion behind it. Admission began inside a system designed to be visible to supervision. The porter's first entry could later connect with several departments. Guardians needed assurance that relief reached people through authorized procedures. Inspectors needed records capable of comparison with the governing order. Staff needed information to allocate clothing, food, and space. These needs explain the strong documentary character of the entrance. They also show why an error made there could travel further inside. A mistaken name or classification might affect property and placement. The point is structural. Early information supported many later actions. A receiving ward allowed that information to be gathered before ordinary residents began. Its practical role was quiet, transitional, and central to the entire establishment. Section 3. Washing and clothing. The admission order required cleansing before a newcomer joined ordinary residents. This instruction connected hygiene with the protection of a grouped population. Washing occurred under institutional supervision rather than private household custom. The precise bath, water supply, temperature, and privacy differed locally. No single description can cover old buildings and later purpose-built workhouses. The reliable fact is the prescribed process and its administrative purpose. Clothing changed at the same transitional stage. Workhouse garments replaced the clothes worn through the entrance. The institution supplied clothing as part of indoor relief. Personal items were retained under rules for storage and eventual restoration. This created two parallel material histories for each resident. One set of garments belonged to daily institutional life. Another waited in a store, attached to a name and record. The order expected removed clothing to be cleaned when necessary. It also required storage arranged so that property could be identified. Staff attention and accurate records were therefore necessary. Property storage had a personal consequence because the correct garments were meant to return on departure. The rule described the desired result, not a guarantee against loss. Issued clothing helped make residents visible as members of classified departments. Its appearance could differ between unions and across decades. The 8 sources do not support one universal color or complete outfit. They establish provision of clothing and regulation of personal garments. A plain institutional issue is enough to understand the change. Uniform management mattered more than any imagined fabric pattern. Washing spaces formed part of a wider service arrangement within the building. Water, laundry, storage, and ward supply required practical circulation. Clean garments had to move towards residents, while used garments moved away. The sources support officer duties concerning cleanliness and clothing. Still, physical organization was necessary for the prescribed system to operate. Corridors and service doors quietly carried much of that routine. The change of clothing also marked a boundary between personal and institutional time. Outside garments held the practical marks of travel and prior work. Inside garments belonged to schedules shared by many other residents. This observation explains material transition without claiming private feelings. It remained possible for personal clothes to be returned later. Storage therefore signaled that residence could end, even when duration was unknown. The institution managed both entry and the possibility of departure. Different resident classes required clothing suited to their assigned places and duties. Children, adults, sick residents, and older people did not share identical needs. The order placed responsibility upon officers to maintain proper supplies. Local guardians approved spending and oversaw institutional management. Quality and adequacy could consequently vary between unions. A central requirement created an expectation, while local purchasing shaped the result. This recurring pattern appears throughout food, bedding, education, and medical care. Cleanliness duties continued after the first admission wash. The matron supervised cleanliness within the women's wards and clothing arrangements. The master carried extensive responsibilities for order elsewhere in the establishment. Nurses or attendants worked around sick residents under medical direction. Children lived within school and ward routines managed by appointed staff. These roles divided care into accountable offices. Their existence again proves an intended structure, not equal skill everywhere. The workhouse provided clothing because indoor relief covered basic material needs. That provision cannot be separated from institutional control over choice and property. Residents received garments, but officials selected, stored, counted, and distributed them. The arrangement reduced private variation within common wards. It also allowed officers to manage washing and replacement at scale. Such order could appear in inventories and accounts. Surviving local records may preserve these details, though holdings remain uneven. Rules about clothing connected several moments that were far apart in time. Admission began the chain through removal and listing. Daily residents continued it through issue, cleaning, repair, and replacement. Discharge completed it through restoration of stored belongings. One administrative failure might break the connection between entrance and exit. The order attempted to prevent that by assigning duties clearly. Stored possessions remained under institutional custody while their owners wore issued garments. Records connected personal property with admission and later discharge. Institutional clothing moved through the house according to need and classification. The central material fact is one of custody and intended return. After cleansing and changing, a resident became ready for ordinary placement. The receiving department had completed its main purpose. Health and classification now guided movement towards a ward. Personal clothing remained behind under the institution's care. Issued garments accompanied the resident into the daily timetable. From this point, sleeping, eating, working, schooling, or treatment shaped the routine. Clothing inventories linked personal property with institutional accounting. Officers distinguished resident garments from house supplies. The two groups of objects followed different paths through storage. This mattered at discharge, when private clothing should reappear. It also mattered during inspection because supplies belonged to union management. A record might describe clothing without describing how it fitted. Administrative completeness and personal experience were not the same thing. Repair formed a practical part of maintaining common clothing stocks. Garments had to remain serviceable while residents entered and left. Local arrangements determined sewing, mending, washing, or distribution. Their necessity is clearer than their exact organization. Institutional material life depended upon ordinary maintenance. The first wash also placed the newcomer within health rules. Medical examination and cleansing occurred close together in the sequence. Both prepared safe placement among existing residents. A concern identified by the medical officer could alter the route. The person might enter separate care instead of an ordinary ward. This flexibility existed within a highly classified system. Categories could respond to changes in bodily condition. The order addressed procedure more than subjective dignity. Buildings offered different amounts of space and separation. Staffing and crowding could further affect actual experience. Without local testimony, strong claims would be speculative. Its implications are evident without invented detail. Institutional custody changed the meaning of ordinary possessions. A coat or dress became an item requiring identification and storage. The resident's name linked that object to an admission entry. House clothing, by contrast, belonged to a managed supply shared across changing populations. Officers had to keep these material streams distinct. The order's detail suggests official awareness that property required accountability. It says less about the emotional value of any particular garment. That silence should remain rather than receive an invented history. Physical objects nevertheless reveal the reach of administration. Rules followed clothing from the receiving room into storage and back towards discharge. Even garments not worn during residence remained part of institutional work. Their stillness in a store depended upon active records, space, and officer responsibility. Section 4. Wards and sleep. Ordinary wards housed residents according to the workhouse classification system. Men and women occupied separate departments within the larger institution. Children and adults could also follow different routines and spaces. Health and capacity created further distinctions under the central order. The ward was therefore not simply a room containing anyone needing relief. It belonged to a particular administrative class. Doorways and passages helped preserve those divisions through the day. Dormitories added another layer to the planned routine. They were sleeping rooms rather than general daytime gathering places. The order restricted access during appointed working periods. This rule separated rest from labor within institutional time. It also allowed officers to supervise where residents should be. Actual enforcement may have differed according to staffing and local conditions. The written requirement remains clearer than its universal practice. Officers were directed to inspect sleeping accommodation and maintain ventilation. Such duties show official concern with shared indoor air and orderly rooms. They also imply windows or other means of airing each space. Nor do they establish identical dormitory size across the country. An older adapted building could differ sharply from a model plan workhouse. The governing order nevertheless expected supervised sleeping areas. Night brought a quieter timetable but not the end of oversight. Officers had responsibilities for rounds and institutional order. Residents remained within classed accommodation while the building settled. A corridor linked dormitories without merging their populations. Doors preserved divisions already created during admission. The arrangement made sleep part of the regulated day. It offered shelter while continuing the institution's emphasis on separation. Model plans influenced many workhouses built during the Middle Victorian decades. Their geometry could make supervision easier through arranged ranges and sightlines. Historic England presents these plans as influential rather than universal. Local land, existing buildings, budgets, and later additions changed actual layouts. Therefore, no imagined central viewpoint applies to every workhouse. What remained consistent was the administrative desire to keep classes apart. Architecture provided practical methods for maintaining that policy. Married couples did not ordinarily share a sleeping room under this arrangement. Men's and women's dormitories belonged to separate sides or departments. Parents might also sleep apart from children housed in their own wards. These facts describe institutional organization without revealing each family's response. No dialogue is needed to recognize their significance. The building itself established distance through assigned rooms and controlled routes. Daily contact could be limited by the same structure. Ward cleanliness fell within the stated duties of senior officers. Bedding, rooms, residence, and ventilation required continuing attention. The order distributed responsibility so neglect could be identified administratively. Yet a duty printed on paper is not direct evidence of performance. Inspections and complaints sometimes existed precisely because practice could fall short. The dormitory scale arose from collective provision rather than family household life. Multiple sleeping places occupied one supervised institutional room. Shared arrangements made classification and ventilation especially important. They also reduced privacy in ways consistent with limited comfort. The ledger supports this broad institutional character, though not exact occupancy everywhere. Capacity could change as local demand changed. Buildings sometimes expanded, altered, or acquired separate medical wards over time. Day rooms and yards provided classed areas outside sleeping hours. Their relationship to dormitories depended upon each site's plan. Residents moved between functions according to schedule and officer direction. The same person might pass from ward to dining place, then work area. Children followed routes connecting sleeping accommodation and school. Sick residents remained within another pattern shaped by medical needs. Institutional life consisted partly of these repeated movements through separated space. Quiet at night would never have been perfectly uniform. Large shared rooms contained ordinary human movement and illness. Dormitories existed for sleep within supervised departments. The ward also reveals how individual identity met mass administration. Every resident needed a place, yet placement followed a general class. Officers counted capacity and reported upon accommodation. Registers and inspection duties turned rooms into measurable institutional resources. At the same time, each bed belonged temporarily to one person. The sources preserve administrative concern more readily than that person's nightly thoughts. Morning returned residents to the ordered sequence of the house. Dormitory access narrowed as working periods began. Washing, meals, labor, schooling, or treatment followed according to class. The building opened different routes without dissolving its divisions. An ordinary day depended upon coordination among wards and service rooms. The dining schedule formed one of its clearest shared rhythms. Capacity mattered whenever officers assigned sleeping accommodation. The order expected attention to residents placed within rooms. Inspection could compare occupied spaces with authorized arrangements. A figure in a report described only its own moment. Population changed through admissions, discharges, illness, and season. Scale is understood through collective rooms and continuing oversight. Ventilation duties connected architecture with daily staff action. Windows or openings alone could not guarantee fresh air. Someone had to manage rooms according to the rules. Cold weather, building condition, and local habits complicated that task. The requirement proves official recognition of the issue. Regulations describe desired conditions more readily than results. Sleeping accommodation also required stores and replacement supplies. Bedding moved through systems of cleaning, issue, and record keeping. The ledger supports ward and cleanliness responsibilities. Those details may survive for individual unions within inventories. Here, they remain research questions rather than asserted facts. Physical routine extended well beyond the occupied bed. Older and infirm residents complicated simple divisions between work and rest. Capacity shaped classification and daily expectation. Someone unable to perform ordinary labor needed suitable accommodation. The order recognized differences within its controlling framework. Actual placement depended upon facilities available locally. Dormitory populations were administratively selected rather than random. Categories could also carry different local interpretations. Wards were also places where officers could observe changes in health. A resident who became unwell might need medical attention and different accommodation. This possibility connected ordinary sleeping rooms with infirmary arrangements. It also required information to pass between ward supervision and the medical officer. The order defines responsibilities without describing each notification. Local staffing determined how smoothly communication worked. Shared accommodation made prompt attention especially relevant to institutional management. It only supports the prescribed relationship among observation, reporting, and care. Dormitories therefore belonged to more than the nightly timetable. They were classed spaces within a system attentive to capacity, sickness, cleanliness, and order. Their doors opened towards several administrative decisions each morning. Section 5. Meals. Workhouse food followed approved dietary tables rather than individual household choice. The governing order tied ordinary meals to these formal schedules. A table specified provision for resident classes under administrative oversight. This made food both nourishment and a recorded institutional expense. Guardians and officers could compare what was supplied with what was authorized. The existence of a dietary does not prove flawless service at every meal. It establishes the intended framework within which local kitchens operated. Food reached residents through a chain of rooms and duties. Supplies entered storage before preparation in the kitchen. Prepared portions then moved towards dining spaces or wards. Officers were responsible for seeing that meals matched approved arrangements. Sick residents might receive food under medical direction instead. Children could have provision considered separately from adults. Each stage depended upon staff, equipment, accounts, and timely distribution. The 8-source ledger does not support one universal daily menu. Dietaries differed by place, resident class, and changing administrative decisions. A surviving children's dietary records a local medical recommendation. It proves that children's food could be formally specified with medical involvement. For that reason, familiar lists of gruel, bread, or meat are omitted here. The important supported detail is regulation through dietary tables. Dining arrangements preserved classification beyond the wards. Men, women, and children did not become one household at meals. Separate departments and schedules maintained the workhouse structure. The room used for eating might vary with the building. Some functions occupied dedicated spaces, while older premises required adaptation. We can reasonably picture ordered seating only in general terms. The medical officer held a particular relationship to food. Medical advice could alter provision for sick residents or shape recommendations. The children's dietary source demonstrates this role in one documented setting. Such evidence is concrete but local, and its limits matter. A recommendation may differ from an approved table or actual service. Administrative papers often record proposals before outcomes. Meals also joined daily life to the guardian's financial responsibilities. Food had to be purchased, stored, prepared, distributed, and accounted for. Records could allow inspection of quantities and expenditure. The central order defined officer duties around those processes. Local decisions influenced contractors, ingredients, and practical quality. Thus, a national framework met local markets within each workhouse kitchen. Variation was built into administration even where rules used common language. Regular timing helped coordinate many residents and several departments. Nevertheless, meals formed appointed pauses within work, school, and ward routines. Kitchen labor began before food appeared in a dining place. Cleaning continued after residents moved to another activity. This hidden service work supported the visible institutional timetable. Its workers could include staff and assigned residents under local arrangements. Approved dietaries made portions legible to supervisors and inspectors. They offered a standard against which provision might be judged. A written allowance could not ensure cooking quality or equal distribution. Nor does a complaint automatically describe every meal in that institution. Sources capture rules, objections, recommendations, and accounts from different viewpoints. Their evidence should remain separate before conclusions are drawn. The calmest accurate picture is structured provision with variable execution. Children's meals sat beside their school routine and developing needs. The surviving dietary page shows a medical officer considering suitable provision. This gives one voice within a wider administrative process. It also warns against treating children as simply smaller adult residents. Their classification affected education, accommodation, and food. Local practice could shift across the long Victorian period. One document offers an example, not a permanent national menu. Sick residents occupied another special position within institutional feeding. The medical officer could direct care according to health. Meals might reach an infirmary ward rather than a common dining area. This movement linked kitchen work with medical supervision. The sources support the official relationship, not a detailed tray or recipe. Even small physical details must remain within the evidence. A doorway between services matters because it enabled prescribed care. Eating inside the workhouse meant receiving a basic provision under rules. The system intentionally limited comfort, yet still required authorized food. Both elements belong in the same historical account. Overstatement in either direction would flatten a varied record. Meals show provision, restriction, management, and local difference at once. When the appointed meal ended, departments returned to separate routines. Children moved towards instruction or their ward. Adults capable of labor went towards assigned tasks. Sick people remained under medical arrangements. Officers checked rooms, supplies, conduct, and records. The work period occupied much of the institution's organized day. Kitchen storage placed dietaries in contact with real supplies. An approved table became a meal through purchasing and preparation. Officers monitored stock while guardians managed expenditure. Local scarcity or failure could affect delivery, though neither is assumed. Accounts might reveal what entered the institution. Dietary tables reveal what authorities intended residents to receive. Comparing them can expose distance between plan and provision. Dining spaces required cleaning, order, and movement between departments. Residents arrived from different parts without dissolving their classifications. Staff coordinated entry and departure around the wider timetable. Detailed reconstruction needs a building plan or local rule. Function alone supports a restrained spatial picture. The room received groups, food, supervision, and service remains. Meals were repeated daily, yet evidence often captures exceptional concern. A complaint may describe poor quality because something prompted its writer. A dietary may survive because officials debated or approved it. An account exists because spending required documentation. None transparently records an average mouthful. Historical method combines these partial views cautiously. The result is modest but more trustworthy. The language of allowance could make food appear entirely numerical. For residents, eating remained a bodily part of the day. Rules treated meals as scheduled provision for classified groups. Medical officers could modify arrangements where health required. Personal preference had little place in this structure. Food was organized through authority rather than household negotiation. Dietary administration joined paper standards to repeated physical work. Someone interpreted the table, arranged supplies, prepared food, and oversaw service. Another record might account for expenditure or stock. Medical advice could create a variation for particular residents. Each layer produced a different kind of evidence. An authorized table tells us entitlement within the system. A kitchen account may show purchasing. A complaint may identify one alleged failure. A medical recommendation records professional advice at a particular moment. These documents should not be blended into one imaginary meal. Their careful combination instead reveals how provision was supposed to function. Food moved from decision to store, from preparation to department, and finally to residents. At every stage, local execution shaped the result permitted by national rules. Section 6. Work. Required work formed part of indoor relief after the reformed Poor Law. The National Archives includes labor among the provisions and conditions of residence. Central rules directed officers to organize employment suited to classifications. This requirement did not create one identical task across all workhouses. Local facilities, contracts, residents, and policies affected available labor. The reliable claim is that capable residents were expected to work. Specific occupations need evidence from a particular institution. Workspaces could occupy yards, service rooms, or other assigned areas. Their position helped keep male and female departments separate. Tasks connected with institutional maintenance also required circulation between stores and wards. The model plan principle supported controlled movement, though designs varied. A resident's route to work therefore depended upon class and local layout. The building organized labor physically as well as administratively. Doors and boundaries prevented every task from becoming a shared activity. The master carried duties concerning the work of male residents. The matron supervised women's arrangements within her department. These responsibilities fitted the broader separation of the house. Other officers managed stores, accounts, schooling, and medical needs around them. Work could not be assigned without considering sickness or capacity. Classification from admission continued to shape the ordinary day. Administrative categories followed residents far beyond the receiving ward. The rules restricted dormitory use during designated working periods. That detail shows how labor structured both time and access. Sleeping rooms were not intended as daytime refuges for capable residents. Officers could direct people towards the spaces assigned for activity. The rule states an expectation, while exceptions might follow illness or infirmity. Staffing and local conditions could affect daily control. Many popular accounts focus upon a small set of notorious workhouse tasks. The present ledger does not support repeating those details as universal experience. Some tasks certainly appear in wider workhouse history, but they need direct sourcing. Here, work remains described at the level the 8 sources allow. It was compulsory within the system for those considered capable. Its exact form varied among unions and resident classes. This restraint protects the difference between broad policy and local example. Institutional labor could support the daily operation of the building. Meals, clothing, cleaning, and supplies all required continuing practical effort. The order assigned responsibility for organizing residents' employment and maintaining order. Paid staff also held defined roles within the establishment. A cautious account therefore avoids allocating each unseen action. It simply recognizes the work necessary to sustain communal provision. Records connected labor to supervision. Officers needed to know who belonged in each class and department. Illness could interrupt an assignment and require medical attention. Children followed educational requirements rather than an adult working routine. Older or infirm people might have different capacities. These distinctions made work another expression of classification. They also show why admission examination mattered throughout residence. The principle of limited comfort shaped expectations surrounding labor. Indoor relief supplied basic needs within a deliberately regulated setting. Required work distinguished the institution from unconditional accommodation. Yet policy language cannot tell us how each task felt or proceeded. Local guardians and staff translated the principle into ordinary practice. Surviving complaints may illuminate failures without becoming representative statistics. Time in the workhouse moved through functions rather than personal choice. Meals interrupted labor at appointed moments. Dormitories remained closed during much of the active day. Wards, yards, schoolrooms, and offices operated in parallel. Officers passed information between these areas through spoken instruction and written books. The system itself supplies the narrative connection. Work areas also belonged to the inspectable institution. Guardians and visiting officials could examine conditions and compliance. A rule on paper became visible through people, tools, rooms, and schedules. Whether appearance matched reality required observation and reliable reporting. Inspections offered moments of oversight, but not continuous knowledge. Institutional life continued between visits under local management. This gap helps explain why rules and practice must remain distinct. For children, the central order placed formal instruction within daily expectations. Their time could include age-appropriate work, though this ledger supports schooling more clearly. The strongest evidence concerns schoolrooms, hours of instruction, and variation. Children therefore receive their own section rather than becoming an aside to adult labor. Their workhouse day followed a separate administrative path. As the work period closed, residents returned through the institution's divided routes. Clothing, bodies, rooms, and tools remained under supervision. The timetable moved again towards meals, wards, and sleep. Repetition of schedule did not mean every day was historically identical. Illness, admission, discharge, staffing, and inspections could alter operations. What endured was the framework of classified, required activity. Labor distinguished capable adults from residents assigned other routines. Medical judgment could remove someone from ordinary work expectations. Age and infirmity shaped capacity within classification. Children followed schooling requirements occupying part of their day. These boundaries required communication among officers. A change in one department could affect another. Work was tied to the wider administrative network. The institution's needs created constant practical activity. Clothing required movement, meals required service, and rooms needed care. Some labor could be organized among residents while staff retained responsibility. The order explains oversight better than the exact division of hands. It would mislead to assign every broom or cooking task automatically. Local evidence is needed for that precision. General operations still depended upon coordinated work. Work rules served the policy of making indoor relief restrictive. Required activity and limited comfort belonged to the same design. This does not establish that every task was deliberately cruel. Nor does it make labor a free personal occupation. Its institutional meaning came from obligation and classification. Local examples might show additional complexity. Broad sources establish only this controlled framework. Work occupied locally assigned spaces within the premises. Its location reflected classification, supervision, and the divided plan. Exact equipment differed with the tasks authorized by each union. Labor remained part of the building's managed daily routine. Work also affected how officers understood institutional capacity. A resident classed as capable entered a different routine from someone infirm. That decision influenced daytime location, supervision, and access to dormitories. Illness could later require reconsideration. The classification system therefore acted as an ongoing administrative tool. It was not merely a label fixed beside the entrance. Work made those categories visible through daily movement. Groups went towards assigned spaces while other residents followed medical or educational routes. The building's divisions helped officers maintain this arrangement. They show only the official concern with capacity and ordered employment. This distinction protects a broad history from becoming a false account of individual fitness. Section 7. Children. Children entered workhouses within the same relief system as adults. Their age created distinct needs for accommodation, instruction, food, and supervision. Most workhouses had a schoolroom according to National Archives guidance. That broad statement still allows significant local variation. A schoolroom might belong to a purpose-built range or adapted premises. Its presence did not guarantee one standard educational experience. Teaching changed between unions and across the Victorian period. The central order required daily instruction for children above stated ages. National Archives guidance summarizes the expectation as at least 3 hours. This is the memorable figure for the children's section. It describes prescribed provision rather than proven attendance everywhere. Staffing, health, local management, and space could affect practice. A timetable might reserve a defined portion of the day for lessons. The rule gave inspectors and guardians a standard to examine. Basic education formed the core of the official requirement. The evidence supports instruction without supplying a universal classroom scene. Desks, slates, books, and wall displays require local documentation before description. Even the arrangement of pupils could change with room and staff. The safest physical observation is functional. A schoolroom separated teaching from wards, meals, and adult work. It placed learning within the managed geography of the house. Children did not necessarily remain beside their parents. Classification could place them in separate wards and routines. Schooling reinforced this distinct institutional day. Movement between sleeping accommodation, instruction, meals, and yards followed supervision. The building could keep children apart while still housing one family inside. Administrative distance is clear enough on its own. Education varied because unions implemented rules through local resources. Guardians appointed staff and managed institutional spending. Teachers worked within arrangements shaped by numbers, rooms, and expectations. Changes across decades also mattered as wider educational ideas developed. Therefore, one workhouse photograph or document cannot define the whole century. The National Archives explicitly warns about local and chronological variation. That warning belongs at the center of any honest reconstruction. Children's food could receive separate administrative attention. One surviving page presents a dietary recommended by a medical officer. The document demonstrates medical involvement and formal specification. It remains a local recommendation rather than a universal menu. Its value lies partly in that limited scale. We see an officer considering children as a particular nutritional group. Health, age, and development connected the schoolroom with medical oversight. A child who became sick could move into infirmary arrangements. Attendance and ordinary routine would then change. The sources establish officer responsibilities, but not every individual decision. No invented pupil is needed to explain the system. The transition between departments followed institutional assessment. Records might capture it only indirectly or not at all. Schooling represented a genuine provision inside a restrictive institution. The system supplied instruction while separating families and controlling daily life. Both facts can remain together without moral commentary. Education might offer useful learning, yet its quality was uneven. The official requirement expressed an intention that local practice could meet imperfectly. Historical balance means preserving that uncertainty. The schoolroom also generated its own quiet administrative needs. Attendance, materials, staffing, and progress required organization. The schoolmaster or schoolmistress worked within the wider hierarchy. Reports could carry information towards guardians or inspectors. The exact surviving paperwork differs between archives. Central guidance does not promise a complete local school record. Researchers must follow each union's holdings and catalogue structure. Children grew older while living within these arrangements. Classification and expected activity could consequently change over time. Rules named age categories, but local records are needed for individual movement. A register may preserve a birth, baptism, admission, or discharge. Together, such entries can outline part of a childhood. They still leave ordinary thoughts and friendships largely beyond official view. The long Victorian period brought changes that a single phrase can hide. Early post-reform buildings reflected one stage of administration. Later educational and medical developments altered institutional priorities. Local unions changed at different speeds and with different resources. This is why the children's evidence should never become a timeless tableau. The schoolroom was a function within a changing public institution. Its walls held different practices across years and places. At the end of lessons, children returned to other classified spaces. Their route remained separate from many adult departments. Meals, washing, recreation, and sleep continued under supervision. Some children also experienced sickness and entered medical care. The infirmary reveals another area where workhouse provision changed significantly over time. The teacher stood between care and institutional discipline. Instruction fitted the wider schedule of meals, wards, and supervision. Children arrived as a classified group, not from separate homes each morning. This shaped the school day unlike an ordinary parish school. Sources support the setting and daily requirement. Those aspects remained local and personal. Education could be inspected against a stated minimum expectation. Guardians and central authorities could ask whether instruction occurred. A timetable or report might show compliance on paper. Classroom practice depended upon teachers and available resources. The difference resembles every other workhouse department. Standards created accountability without guaranteeing quality. Documents must be read for purpose and limitation. Children's records may be scattered across several administrative series. An admission book might connect with schooling, baptism, or discharge. Names and ages could vary in spelling or accuracy. Family relationships require careful comparison rather than assumption. The research guide identifies possible holdings without promising completeness. Investigation proceeds through multiple small confirmations. One isolated entry seldom explains an entire childhood. Recreation and companionship remain important subjects, but this ledger says little. Such a scene would exceed the evidence selected here. The supported account notes classified spaces and supervised time. Children were still children within those constraints. Their undocumented ordinary moments should remain possible rather than falsely described. The schoolroom affected architectural planning as well. A room needed access and separation from competing functions. Purpose-built institutions could include it within a classed range. Adapted premises might use any suitable existing space. Function guides only a cautious physical inference. Education occupied real space, though its form varied. Schooling joined future possibility with present institutional control. Basic instruction might provide useful knowledge beyond residence. Attendance still occurred within a compulsory daily structure. These observations are compatible without becoming a verdict. Evidence does not measure later outcomes for all pupils. It shows education was required and unevenly delivered. Stronger conclusions need individual records or broader research. The education requirement also placed childhood within official accountability. A lesson was not simply a private kindness offered by one employee. It belonged to the expected operation of the institution. Guardians could support rooms and staff, while inspection could examine provision. This public framework makes the schoolroom historically visible. Actual learning remains harder to measure from rules alone. Local documents may offer closer evidence where they survive. The broad ledger therefore establishes structure, duration, and variation. It avoids inventing exercises, progress, or a representative pupil. Children's experience deserves that restraint because administrative sources already speak so loudly on their behalf. Section 8. Sickness and Infirmary. Medical examination began at admission and continued through institutional residence. The medical officer attended sick residents and advised on their treatment. Officers were expected to report illness rather than leave it outside administration. Separate accommodation could protect other residents and support care. These arrangements were prescribed by rules, but quality varied locally. A medical office on an establishment list does not prove constant attendance. Practice depended upon people, facilities, demand, and changing standards. Infirmary space distinguished sickness from ordinary ward life. Its rooms might stand within the main building or a later addition. The precise relationship depended upon the history of each site. Some workhouses expanded medical provision as the century advanced. Historic England's study of Hampstead gives a documented example. That site must remain an example rather than a national model. It shows change clearly without proving the same timetable elsewhere. Hampstead Union Workhouse was built during 1849 and 1850. A dispensary and infirmary were added there in 1869. These additions reflected growing provision for sick and infirm residents. The dates serve as this section's limited numerical landmark. They belong only to the Hampstead site in London. Other unions built, adapted, or delayed medical accommodation differently. One building history offers evidence of development, not uniform progress. Later ward planning at Hampstead showed Florence Nightingale's influence. This named connection belongs to that architectural report. Planning ideas could travel while local buildings remained varied. Ward form increasingly reflected attention to air, spacing, and medical organization. The source supports influence in later design, not an identical national blueprint. Careful phrasing keeps architectural history at its proper scale. The medical officer's duties joined several departments. Newcomers required examination in the receiving area. Sick residents needed attention in wards or infirmary accommodation. Dietary decisions could involve medical advice. Records also had to capture illness and related events. This role therefore connected bodies, rooms, food, and paperwork. Institutional medicine was never confined to one doorway. Senior officers had duties to notify and assist around sickness. Nurses or attendants carried out care within local staffing arrangements. The order outlines responsibilities more securely than bedside experience. Nor can it reconstruct an average treatment from 8 broad sources. Unsupported medical detail would create false precision. The infirmary's atmosphere also cannot be universalized. Different construction dates produced different windows, ventilation, and ward scales. Later additions might contrast with older main ranges. Some spaces were purpose-built, while others were adapted. Historic England's building investigation makes architectural change visible at Hampstead. Beyond that example, only cautious general observations are justified. Medical rooms required separation, access, supervision, and service connections. Food reached sick residents under arrangements shaped by medical direction. This linked dietary management with treatment. The children's dietary source further shows that medical officers could recommend provision. Yet a recommendation and an actual meal remain different evidence types. The distinction is small but important. Administrative history often survives in proposals, approvals, and instructions. Each document records a stage rather than the entire outcome. Illness could interrupt ordinary work, school, or ward routine. Classification was therefore not permanently fixed after admission. A change in health could require another room and another level of attention. Officers needed to communicate that change and update relevant records. The institution responded through its hierarchy and available accommodation. Rules define the expected response more clearly than its reliability. Births and deaths might also enter surviving workhouse records. Local archives can hold registers connected with these events. The presence and completeness of such books differ among unions. An entry supplies a date and identity when preserved. It rarely gives a full account of care surrounding the event. Researchers therefore combine registers with correspondence and institutional papers. Even then, absence and silence remain part of the archive. Growing medical provision changed the later identity of some workhouse sites. Hampstead's later history as New End Hospital illustrates that longer development. The evidence in this ledger focuses upon its workhouse and infirmary fabric. Still, specialized additions could shift attention towards sickness and infirmity. Architecture records that change where documents and buildings survive together. From a sick ward, the wider house remained connected through administration. Meals arrived, officers reported, registers changed, and inspectors could examine conditions. Medical care thus depended on systems beyond the bedside. The next section follows those systems into offices and surviving archives. There, ordinary movements became lines, letters, and official reports. Medical additions altered circulation through an established site. New wards needed links with kitchens, stores, entrances, and staff routes. They might create clearer separation from ordinary accommodation. Hampstead's history demonstrates actual extension over time. Additions still show architecture responding to changing functions. Institutions could be physically revised as medical priorities grew. The word infirmary can suggest one stable building type. In reality, accommodation reflected its date and local resources. Early main house rooms differed from later specialized ranges. The ledger supports development through one investigated example. Some unions changed sooner or more thoroughly. Variation remains part of the historical truth. Inspection of medical accommodation could identify compliance or deficiency. Yet an inspector saw only one limited visit. Residents and staff experienced wards across much longer periods. Correspondence may complicate an official account. Building evidence can reveal later improvement without describing earlier care. No source offers total vision. Reliable history emerges from their careful overlap. Medical provision shows especially clearly why the Victorian period cannot be treated as still. A workhouse built early in the reformed system might gain new rooms later. Those rooms could embody different assumptions about ward planning. Hampstead's additions provide one securely dated example of that process. The building record allows change to be seen in walls and ranges. Nor does it prove that other unions followed at the same pace. Architecture offers evidence of investment and intended function. Treatment quality requires different records. Keeping those questions separate prevents a later infirmary plan from becoming proof about every sick resident. It also lets physical history contribute exactly what it knows best: sequence, form, connection, and alteration. Section 9. Records and Inspections. Workhouse administration produced many kinds of written record. Admission and discharge books traced movement through the institution. Other holdings may include births, baptisms, deaths, staff appointments, and correspondence. Local survival varies, so no archive holds every expected series. The National Archives Research Guide directs researchers towards relevant local collections. These documents preserve institutional actions unevenly rather than complete lived experience. Their gaps require the same care as their entries. Central Poor Law correspondence survives in the National Archives series MH12. The guide covers material from 1834 to 1871 within that series. Letters connected unions and central authorities across administrative distance. They could concern rules, disputes, buildings, appointments, or resident complaints. Catalogues and local context remain necessary for responsible use. The Workhouse Voices resource draws attention to correspondence from residents. Such letters offer rare language from people receiving relief. They may describe a complaint, request, or particular institutional problem. Their survival matters because official books often compress people into categories. Yet writers who complained formed a self-selecting group. Their letters cannot provide rates for satisfaction or mistreatment. They illuminate cases without becoming a neutral sample. Registers served practical needs inside the workhouse. Officers needed to connect names with admission, classification, property, and departure. Medical events and institutional supplies created further paperwork. Staff appointments also left administrative traces. Each book belonged to a purpose and should be read accordingly. A discharge register answers different questions from a complaint letter. Combining them can strengthen context without erasing their different viewpoints. Inspection gave the system another form of oversight. The post-reform arrangement introduced stricter rules and regular inspection. Inspectors could examine conditions and compare practice with requirements. Their presence did not make observation continuous. Institutions operated for long periods between particular visits. Staff could prepare records and spaces for scrutiny. An inspection report, therefore, offers valuable evidence within a limited moment. Boards of guardians occupied the local center of supervision. They oversaw the union and its workhouse through meetings and appointed officers. Clerks communicated decisions and maintained administrative connections. Guardians could consider expenditure, staffing, buildings, and supplies. Their records reflect governance more readily than private ward experience. Minutes may show what was proposed or authorized. Actual delivery sometimes requires confirmation from another kind of evidence. The central order assigned duties in unusually detailed form. It covered receiving, clothing, classification, meals, wards, children, illness, work, and discharge. This breadth made the institution legible to administrators. It also creates a temptation for historians to narrate every duty as completed. That temptation must be resisted. A regulation is strong evidence for prescription. Practice needs records of action, observation, or credible testimony. Architecture could also be inspected as a form of evidence. Surviving buildings show divisions, additions, routes, and changing priorities. Historic England's Hampstead investigation combines fabric with documentary research. A blocked doorway or later ward may reveal institutional change. Yet buildings have often been altered after workhouse use. Physical evidence requires dating and careful interpretation. It complements written records without automatically resolving every question. Names of places, people, and laws carry special evidential weight. The Poor Law Amendment Act belongs to the national framework. Florence Nightingale appears only through influence on later Hampstead planning. Hampstead provides a local architectural example rather than a typical institution. The National Archives identifies MH12 as a central correspondence series. Each named claim therefore has a defined source and limited scope. Numbers also require restraint in calm historical narration. Dates can anchor reform, construction, additions, and archival coverage. Too many figures would turn an institutional walk into a catalogue. Exact article references remain in the research ledger rather than crowding the prose. The order's content matters more here than reciting its numbering. Listeners receive scale without a stream of dates. Source completeness does not mean historical completeness. The archive favors administration because institutions needed written accountability. Residents appear most fully when a letter or unusual record survives. Ordinary quiet moments seldom generated paperwork. It acknowledges what room, rule, and record can support. Inspection and record keeping followed residents from arrival towards departure. A name entered one book and might later appear in another. Stored clothing required identification across the same span. Illness, schooling, or correspondence could create additional traces. Leaving then closed an administrative episode, though not necessarily permanently. Discharge procedures returned the narrative to the entrance. Paper traveled differently from residents within the system. A local clerk sent correspondence towards central offices. Copies, replies, minutes, and reports formed administrative chains. Today, surviving parts rest in national or local archives. Their separation reflects origin and later preservation. Researchers may reconstruct one issue across several catalogues. The workhouse archive is dispersed as well as incomplete. An officer's title tells expected responsibility, not personal character. The master, matron, porter, medical officer, and teacher held defined roles. Records may reveal appointments or disputes involving individuals. Without those documents, character descriptions would be invention. Offices matter because rules attached duties to them. Individual performance remains a local research question. Stable web pages make evidence accessible, but still summarize archives. National Archives' educational resources place documents within teaching contexts. Its research guide directs readers towards records and repositories. Historic England interprets buildings and historical change. The transcribed order provides primary administrative wording. Each source type answers different questions. The ledger records those roles rather than treating every page alike. Completeness checks focus on verifiable special claims. Every year, law, person, place, archive series, and number needs support. Ordinary transitions remain constrained by sourced institutional functions. This method reduces accidental embellishment. Instead, it makes uncertainty visible and gives assertions an appropriate scope. Record creators rarely wrote with future listeners in mind. They documented what administration required at the time. This purpose shaped categories, omissions, and vocabulary. An admission clerk sought useful institutional facts, not a rounded biography. An inspector assessed selected conditions against expectations. A correspondent addressed a specific concern. A building report created much later asks another set of questions. The source ledger identifies these evidence types so their boundaries remain visible. Stable links support checking, but a link alone is not adequate mapping. Each claim needs the exact page that supports its wording and scale. That discipline is particularly necessary for dates and named entities. Section 10. Leaving. Workhouse residence was not automatically a permanent condition. Article 115 of the Central Order allowed a resident to leave after giving reasonable notice to the master. During his absence or inability to act, notice could instead be given to the matron. Officers then prepared the administrative and material steps of departure. The rule establishes a route for leaving, not its ease in every case. Local practice and personal circumstances could complicate the process. Reasonable notice helped officers coordinate a resident's release. Article 116 also allowed guardians to authorize temporary absence without that ordinary notice. These provisions distinguished final departure from an approved temporary absence. Illness or another administrative decision could involve different circumstances. Property stored at admission now became important again. Personal clothing and permitted possessions were supposed to return. Labels and records connected each bundle with its owner. Institutional garments remained behind for continued workhouse use. The change reversed part of the admission process. A resident crossed again between workhouse clothing and personal dress. Accurate storage made that reversal possible. The discharge book could record the outward movement. Where it survives, an entry may supply a date and identifying details. Some people might appear again through another admission. Such repetition can sometimes be traced across local records. Missing volumes or altered spellings may interrupt the trail. Archival reconstruction remains patient and incomplete. Leaving also changed the resident's relationship with institutional space. Wards, work areas, dining rooms, and yards fell behind. The receiving side and entrance again became relevant. Routes through the building remained governed by department and officer direction. Personal movement therefore followed an administrative sequence until the boundary. Beyond it, the ledger offers no universal destination. The road continues without an invented future. Families might leave under circumstances not explained by general rules. Classification had separated relatives during residence. Discharge records may help establish whether departures occurred together. Without a particular book, no reunion scene can be supplied. The careful historical statement is narrower. The institution recorded individuals and managed release through formal duties. Family experience must be studied case by case. Illness could affect whether ordinary discharge procedures applied. Medical responsibility continued while a person remained under care. The sources support officer duties, not a general rule for every medical departure. Similarly, children's movement involved their classified status and supervision. Institutional records often stop at the gate. Human lives continued beyond the documents used here. The possibility of return complicates any simple ending. Indoor relief answered circumstances that could change over time. A later need might produce another admission and another record. The archive sometimes preserves repeated movement, though never perfectly. Workhouse residence was therefore an episode within some lives, not their whole definition. Administrative language can obscure that wider truth. A name in a register belonged to a person beyond its columns. By discharge, the workhouse had supplied shelter, clothing, food, and organized routines. It had also imposed separation, classification, labor, and close supervision. These features came from the same system of indoor relief. Neither provision nor restriction should be removed from the account. Their balance varied through local practice and changing decades. Rules tell us what administrators intended to happen. Buildings, records, and correspondence show partial results. The 8 sources used here occupy different historical positions. National legislation and orders establish structures and duties. Archival guides explain what records survive and where. Resident correspondence reveals particular voices with a sampling limitation. Educational pages interpret documents while warning about variation. Historic England studies broad design and one changing site. Together they support a careful journey, not a complete reconstruction. The workhouse itself also changed during the Victorian period. Model plans influenced new buildings, while older premises remained in use. Infirmary additions could reflect growing medical provision. Schooling varied across unions and decades. Local guardians made decisions within central expectations. Consequently, the building imagined at arrival cannot stand frozen in time. Its rooms belonged to a changing administrative landscape. At the boundary, the institution becomes quieter in the historical record. Officers completed duties, property changed hands, and a register might receive another line. Beyond those actions, certainty narrows. There is no supported dialogue, dramatic revelation, or universal lesson. The evidence leaves a road, a name, and an incomplete future. Behind them, the workhouse continues its measured routine of admissions, wards, meals, work, care, records, and departures. Departure did not erase records created during residence. Books and correspondence remained within institutional custody. Personal clothing left, but administrative traces could stay for generations. Later archivists preserved only part of that paper. Researchers now meet a former resident through what survived. The imbalance between a whole life and several entries is substantial. It deserves acknowledgement rather than narrative filling. Some workhouse buildings outlived their original administrative purpose. Hampstead's later hospital identity provides one example. Continuity can preserve fabric while altering rooms and routes. Later uses may obscure earlier arrangements as much as protect them. Architectural investigation separates phases through evidence. A visible building can contain several institutional histories. Its Victorian form is not always clear from present walls. The national system sought order through unions, guardians, officers, and regulations. Local operation gave that structure material form. Residents encountered rooms, garments, schedules, meals, and books. Those encounters varied without becoming historically unknowable. Sources securely establish many functions and boundaries. They require limits around color, sensation, speech, and personal response. Leaving closes an administrative sequence rather than a moral tale. No source assigns one meaning to every stay. Relief, restriction, illness, schooling, labor, and separation could overlap. Their balance differed by person, place, and time. The evidence supports complexity without dramatic escalation. The final gate is another documented threshold within a larger life. Across these rooms, prescribed order and actual practice remain carefully distinct. The central rules describe a system expected to examine, cleanse, clothe, classify, feed, employ, teach, treat, record, and discharge. National guidance and architectural study reveal how parts of that system developed. Local archives and resident letters can test its operation in particular places. None supports a single universal day experienced in precisely the same way. The workhouse was both a national institution and a collection of local establishments. Its history becomes calmer and clearer when those scales are not confused. What remains is a measured passage through supported functions, material boundaries, documented changes, and acknowledged gaps. Discharge returned control over clothing and movement, but the record remains institutional. A book may confirm departure without describing the first hours outside. The order may specify notice without explaining every personal decision. Stored property rules show intended restoration without proving each bundle arrived intact. These limits do not diminish the documents. They clarify what kind of history those documents can sustain. We can follow procedure calmly to the gate, then stop where evidence stops. This refusal to invent is not an empty conclusion. It preserves the resident's life beyond administrative possession. The institution recorded a period of relief and regulation. It did not contain the whole person, even when its surviving paperwork appears extensive.